Thank you, Rick. 1 Samuel chapter 1. I'm going to read from verse 19 to give a bit of context, a bit of background if you haven't been here or you've forgotten. I'm going to really start from verse 24, but we'll start 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 19. I'll read that and then we'll start on verse 24. 1 Samuel 1:19. The entire family got up early the next morning and went to worship the Lord once more. They returned home to Ramah. When Elkanah slept with Hannah, the Lord remembered her plea, and in due time she gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, I asked the Lord for him. The next year, Elkanah and his family went out their annual trip to offer a sacrifice to the Lord and to keep his vow. But Hannah did not go. She told her husband, wait until the boy is weaned, and I will take him to the tabernacle and leave him with the Lord permanently. Whatever you think is best, Elkanah agreed. Stay here for now, and may the Lord help you keep your promise. So she stayed home and nursed the boy until he was weaned. We've been speaking about this amazing promise, this amazing thing that Hannah has kind of asked of the Lord. If you give me a child, I'll give him back to you for the rest of his days. We think he's around 3 maybe when he's ready to be taken. So again, you've had this moment of barrenness, this time of barrenness, then you get pregnant, and then you get 3 years of living with your son, and there comes the time. There comes this day. And in verse 24 it says, when the child was weaned, Hannah took him to the tabernacle in Shiloh. They brought along a 3-year-old bull for the sacrifice and a basket of flour and some wine. After sacrificing the bull, they brought the boy to Eli the priest. All right, point number 1. At some point, for all of us, what God does is he trains us, right? And after he trains us, the day of testing and faith arrives. So what God does is he knows when you think about everything that's happened. Thomas Baggett passed away last night. That's Lisa's dad and Barbara's husband. He's been going through a lot, and they've been going through a lot, and he passed away last night. And you think about those moments, right? You think God just intervenes when someone's passed? God has been training them. God knows exactly when we're going to pass away, right? God knows exactly what we're going to go through, what we need. And so months, years, days, however long it is before, he speaks to us, he teaches us, he trains us. We might not understand it. We certainly don't see it all. But God doesn't wait and then say, oh, now I've got to do it. He sees everything. He trains us. He's been training Hannah. There's these 3 years of kind of being with Samuel and going through all of the emotions. And excuse me. But in our life, God has days of testing us, right, of faith. These monumental days of, all right, let's see what you got. Abraham had a big one. Not just one day, but we know the big day that he had with Isaac. The day of testing comes, and the day of faith has to be there. Sometime, at some point, the training is over and the day of testing comes. And here's the second part of this point. There's the day where it's all over, where the training is over, and now's the time. It's today. The test is today. It's right now. And what we've been talking about is if you haven't been faithful to the training, you won't be faithful in the test. Like if something monumental is coming, like if someone's going to pass away in your life that's really going to hurt you, what do you think the best training is? Getting to know God, right? Having intimacy with God, understanding him, prayer, study, all of that stuff. If you've been on the sidelines with the Lord for a while, if you haven't really taken advantage of the training, if he's giving you messages and you're just kind of ignoring them, if you're not really close to him, then guess what? Your intimacy with God affects your reactions and your response. Doesn't mean that if you're like being trained and you're taking the training that you'll respond perfectly, but there's definitely something correlated. Like if you haven't taken notice of the training, if you haven't taken the time, like what I'm getting at is Hannah had 3 years, let's say, with Samuel. What does she have to do in those 3 years? She has to get her head around, I'm going to give my baby up, but this is who God is. If she doesn't know who God is, what chance has she got of giving him at the tabernacle? And so we have to be faithful to the training, because if we're not faithful to the training, we won't be faithful in the test. And I keep saying, if you want to know what's coming, Think about what God seems to keep teaching you that isn't relevant today. Think about that. This is how you can not fully understand or fully know, but you can kind of see where you're going. Like, for instance, there are times where God says, be patient, right? And you know you're being impatient, so you know what he's talking about, right? When you're being impatient, sometimes the word is telling you, just be still, right? Sometimes when you're in fear, the Bible keeps telling you, don't worry. Sometimes when things are hard, it keeps talking about the joy of the Lord, and whether it's coming to church or reading in your own or whatever it is, God keeps telling you the same thing. But then there are times where God seems to be teaching you this lesson that doesn't seem relevant. I.e., don't fear. And you're like, I'm not fearing. Be patient. I didn't know I was being impatient this time. Don't, have joy. I have got joy. And you think, why are you telling me this? And then a day, a month, a week, a year, however long it is, you start to realize, that's what that was about. You were telling me beforehand. You were, and I've seen that in my life. I believe that I can almost see what's coming sometimes, a little bit of it, of what he's teaching me. And I think he's teaching Hannah in those moments, in those 3 years. Point number 2 is this, and I'm glad about this. God does train his people, and he trains them perfectly. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 17. I don't want to belabor this because maybe at some point we'll get there, and we've read this story a lot, probably in our lives, of David and Goliath. But we're saying that training affects everything, that there is days of training, months, years, however long it is, and if you haven't been faithful to the training, you won't be faithful in the test. But point number 2 is God trains his people perfectly. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 31, David's question, he walked over to some others and asked them the same question and received the same answer. Verse 31, David's question was reported to King Saul, and the king sent for him. Don't worry about this Philistine, David told Saul. I'll go fight him. Think about this. How does David get that? David is either really brash or really brave. I mean, he tells Goliath, I'm going to have your head. I'm going to cut your head off. Right? He's very, very bold. Now, he's either really, really smart or he's really, really not smart. I mean, when you say to Goliath, I'm going to take your head, and you come towards him, you better have a plan, right? What I'm getting at is this. David's day of battle came, and it's a day of battle that no one else wanted. But God knew. God knew David's life. God knew there would be a day with Goliath. God knew that before time began. And he's been training David. And this isn't the only training, but the Bible gives us an insight into his training. David says to Saul, I'll go fight him. Because David understands he's been trained for this moment. It's Esther. Maybe Mordecai says, maybe it's your time. This is for such a time as this. Saul's response is, don't be ridiculous. That was basically his brothers, everybody's response. They looked at David and they said, don't be silly. People might say that to you, right? Don't be ridiculous. You can't do that. But they don't know that God has trained you. Like how do you know what others have been trained in? You don't. So to look at someone and say, don't be ridiculous, is kind of haphazard, right? You don't really understand. Saul looks at David and says, don't be silly. Don't be ridiculous. There's no way, in verse 33, you can fight this Philistine, and possibly what? You can't fight him and win. You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his what? All right, this is the way the world looks at it, right? But David persisted. And look at what he says. He doesn't say, hey, I've been, weightlifting. I've psyched myself up. No. Look at what David says. This is what I'm talking about, that God trains his people perfectly. And by the Spirit of God, David had enough understanding and wisdom and humility to understand exactly what's going on. Look at what it said. I mean, if you knew you were going to beat Goliath, pride could come, right? But David look at what he said. David persisted. I have been taking care of my father's sheep and my goats. You remember what happens when Samuel comes to anoint David? Where's David at? He's in the fields. He's taking care of what? The sheep. And it's like, is this the one? No, is this the one? And they're like, do you have any more sons? And they're almost like No, we don't. Oh, wait, what's his name's in the field? That little one, the one that you wouldn't want. And it's exactly who God wants. And Dave, look, all these other boys are doing all this stuff, and Dave, the youngest one is just, what's he doing? Oh, he's just a little shepherd boy. Don't worry about him. He's just, out there doing his thing. Yet look what the Spirit of God has taught him. He didn't get this by human wisdom. He got this by God. I have taken care of my father's sheep and goats. That seems insignificant, right? Shepherds were despised. This wasn't like, look at what he says, though. When a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, what would most people say now? I just take it. I'm strong enough. Look at what he says. I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. Nice guy. Don't get on the wrong side of David, right? But look, that sounds kind of like this, like, oh, I'm He-Man and I'm but look at what he says. I think if the story ended there, if the description of the story ended there, we'd have a different understanding of what happened. But he says, I have done this, verse 36, both to lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too. Okay, that sounds a bit brash again, right? A bit kind of like, ooh, I'm going to kill him. But listen to why he understands he's going to be killing him. Look, because he has defied the armies of what? He's defied God. So David knows that if you defy God, God cannot be for Goliath. God cannot be with or for Goliath. David understands that. But look at what he says. Who does he give credit to in verse 37? The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from what? So what he says is, the Lord's done that, the Lord will do this. The Lord's been training me. I think what he's saying is this. The lions and the bears were too much for me. But God gave me strength and power and wisdom, and God allowed me to have victory so that I'm training. And David understood, if God allowed me to do that, if God gave me the victory there, if I could be rescued from the claws of the lion and the bear, and I think the inference is without God's hand, you'd never be what? David on his own versus a lion and bear is going to get what? Killed. At some point, he's going to get mauled. But God protected him, and he was savvy enough to understand that was God that rescued me. And he says, the same God who has shown me he's my protector, my provider, my fighter, is the same God who will rescue me from this Philistine. David's been trained because, and we could use 1,000 examples, you could use you, me, God trains his people perfectly. I read a quote from Kobe Bryant the other day, and it goes into this. He says, training breeds confidence. Think about that. So why did he have this confidence in his ability? Because he put many, many hours into it, right? That if you train, training breeds confidence. If you believe that God has trained you, if you get to a moment and you think, this is what this has all been about, this is why I've been praying, this is why I've been studying, this is why I've been searching. If you believe in God's training, it will breed confidence. Like I've been trained for this moment. And I can't speak about this very long. I get like Pentecostal every time I want to read this. I have about 87 favorite verses, but this is right up there. In 1 Samuel 17:48, if you want to see confidence, if you want to see training, if you want to see power, it's right here. Goliath moves closer to attack. Here's his moment. I told you it's all right. It's one thing to talk to Goliath. It's one thing to tell Saul, I think I can fight him. It's one thing to think, God, maybe you're training me for something with these sheep and goats. But there is a moment where Goliath what? Where Goliath starts to move forward. It's on now. There you go. And that's a response that's amazing. And who was his confidence in? He knew, whether it's boxing, fighting, whatever you want to make it, if you believe you've been trained well, you don't get what? You don't get scared. Look at what it says. Goliath moved closer to attack. David what? David retreated. He walked. He stumbled. He what? How many of us run to our Goliath? I mean, think of it. That must have really spazzed Goliath out. That must have freaked him out. I mean, Goliath, nobody would come near Goliath, and this dude is running towards you. That must have hacked him off. This guy is either the bravest, strongest man he's ever seen, or he's a fool. You know who else was running to Goliath? If he needed anybody to stand with him, what's David done? He's got a problem. Everyone else was like, David didn't cower. Man, that's a whole sermon. I get off of it because otherwise, think about that. He ran to meet him. And we'll get into that story later, but you should know who wins. Yeah. He runs. But not only does God train us, but in verse 37, when he declares, the Lord has rescued me from the claws of the lion, and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. Number 3, so some point the training is over, and if you haven't trained, you won't be faithful in the test. Number 2, God trains his people perfectly. Number 3 is this: God trains through us, his people, perpetually. God trains you perfectly, but through you, he trains perpetually also. That David was trained, right? But David was also training people. Now, Saul wouldn't get it. Other people might not understand it. But isn't it wild that David is training us tonight? That is the legacy you can have. You see, we tend to think that when we're dead, it's over. You know, God can use your life for as long as he wants. How long has David been dead? More than a few days, right? But David's life, David's legacy is that he's still training us. Because his life, this story, and look at what he says. It's the Lord who rescued me. It's the Lord who will rescue me from this Philistine. David has been trained, but David is being used by God to train people. This is how it works. And this, again, is why training is so important, and not understanding or taking or believing or making much of your training is so selfish. Because David was good at training people because he had been what? You know what they don't do at a job? Hopefully, they don't give you the person who doesn't know anything to train you. I mean, it probably happened. There's probably stories. All right. I'm saying it shouldn't happen, right? Day one, if they say, "Can you train the newbie?" You got a problem, right? I mean, who do you want training you? You want someone who understands. Imagine if they were like, "Well, I've never been trained. I don't understand the book. I've never." Oh, that's great. God has trained David, but now he's training through him. Look what he says to Saul. Saul's like, "That's ridiculous." And he's like, whoa. That's ridiculous to you, but the Lord's got this. You see, what God is teaching you, he teaches through you. He wants to train you, not just for you, but so that you can train others. Samuel was weaned, and I want us to think about this. Samuel has been weaned, and so now the reasons to stay have expired. If you go back to chapter 1. Remember what she said. I'm going to stay here until he's weaned, and then I'll what? So that's easier on day 1, but when they're now going to the tabernacle, it gets a little what? It gets a little closer. Do you see what she promised was this? When he's ready, I'll go. Sometimes, some days, we have reasons to stay. Like, God has given us reasons to stay. But how many times do we reason away doing the right thing? What I'm saying is this: if we were Hannah and we said, when he's 3, I'll take him, how many would be tempted to say, how about 5? How about 6? How about never? What I'm telling you is this: sometimes we have these reasons to stay. She had a reason to stay, and I think it was a plausible, acceptable reason that she would stay at home with Samuel for those days. But sometimes we reason away doing the right thing, and God comes and he strips us of our reasons. When we start reasoning, when God is saying, and here's what we don't like. Have you ever said, God said to you, "That's over now," and you fought it? It might be a relationship like that has run its course in the fact that it was for a time, for a season. You may be living in a town you like, and God says no. You might be at a church you like, and God moves you. You might, whatever it is. There are times where you're like, I'm good to stay here because this is good. But then God comes, and you see, like God can strip us of all of our reasons until all of our excuses have been removed. And we might try, Hannah doesn't, but we might try and say, well, can I do it at 4 and can I do it at 5? We've all come up with excuses why we want to stay somewhere we shouldn't. Right? We want to stay. Oh, we do the other too. If we don't want to go, we want to stay places, and sometimes we want to go and we're not meant to go, and we want to do that, and it gets all messed up. But what we have to, God is now got her to the point where now it's moving day. Now it's time to move. And we have to understand, as part of what we're talking about on Sunday, as being our master, that God is allowed to move us from anything or anybody. Think about that statement. What things or people do you not want to be moved away from? All right? Yeah. There's friends you wouldn't want to move from. There's family you wouldn't want to be separated from. There's cities, there's whatever it is. You see, sometimes we don't want to move away, right? Sometimes we don't want to do what we said we might do or we've thought about doing. And sometimes when it gets really, really close, I'll fight Goliath, and then when Goliath starts moving, about that. What I'm telling you is this. We have to understand that God gets to choose and gets to dictate when we move from anything or anyone. You don't get to say, I want to stay here. Well, you can say it, but you don't have the right to stay. God is perfect, right? And he has the right to say, you're moving. And what he does is, he has reasons sometimes for us to stay. And we stay. But then those reasons expire. Like, I had you here for a time. I had you here for a purpose. I had you here for a moment. But that moment has now what? It's expired. I had you in this season. I had you at this job. I had you in this city. I had you in this place. And God gets to say, look, the time has just expired. Her 3 years has expired. It's over. It's done. We're moving on. We don't get to choose. We don't get to choose whether we move or stay in circumstances or places. You have to understand that. God gets to choose how long you stay in circumstances. You see, when the good circumstances, we don't want that to expire. When it's a good circumstance and God says it's over, we're like, no, it ain't over. But when it's a bad circumstance, all we're begging for is what? Would you let this expire? So sometimes in good circumstances, God says, that's it, it's done. And we freak out. Sometimes in bad circumstances, when we want that time to be expired, it keeps going on. And we're like, would you please just hurry up? Understand that we don't get to choose our circumstances. Like, God has that right? That God gets to choose the places of where we serve or where we live or what. God gets to choose all of that. Hannah, I find this interesting. Hannah had been able to stay here for now. She says, in the chapter, she says, I'm going to stay here for now. There's an allotted time. For now, I'm going to stay. But that time is no longer. The time is no longer. The day to travel to the tabernacle was here. It was here. That's expired. Your time with Samuel, think about how brutal that truth is. Your time with Samuel, one-on-one, and with the family, and for those years, that time has now what? All of us have had things that expired that you wanted to keep. Even our time with people, even with Thomas last night, our time with people expires. It's done. And what you have to understand is that God has the right to bring us to an expiration on anything. Like if people pass away, that's his choice. And if you can't accept that, or can't understand that, then you're going to be in trouble. And so Hannah had been able to stay, but no longer. The day comes, all right. And I want you to see, look at what the Bible says, because this is really interesting. Verse 24, when the child was weaned, Hannah took him to the tabernacle in Shiloh. They brought along a 3-year-old bull for the sacrifice and a basket of flour and some wine. They've got some money. These are rich, kind of extravagant offerings. After sacrificing the bull, they brought the boy to Eli. You know, when you're reading your story, if you hadn't read the story, if you didn't know what was about to happen, you already can see where this is going. I want you to picture this. It's her, it's Elkanah, it's Samuel. But there is a hint in the scripture, in these verses, that she was going to do it. What you want to know, if you don't know the story, is time's up. 3 years is done. Are you going to do it? Right? David, you've been trained. Goliath comes. Are you going to do it? He runs towards it. So this moment comes for Hannah to hand Samuel over. She's got to go to the tabernacle. She's got to leave her son. She's got to go back to her home without her firstborn. So what are the hints that she's on the right path? Number one is this: she just went. That's a good start, right? I mean, if she was refusing, if she was disobedient, the fact you get the same hint with Abraham and Isaac. When God says, go and kill your son, your only son, what does the next verse say? The next morning, Abraham saddled up his donkey and went. You already know. It doesn't say Abraham argued for 6 months. No. So the fact that she went gives you a clue she's on the right path. But notice what she took with her. What did she take with her? A 3-year-old bull, which if he was 3, there's ever since Samuel's been around, they've had this bull. But the bull is for what? The bull is a burnt offering, which is a God, you have everything. What's easier to do? Bring a bull or take your son? Okay, so here she bring. Do you notice though? Like what I'm getting at is this: if she was kind of miffed, if she was kind of not really into this, if she was kind of begrudgingly walking, she may not have brought what? She brings her worship with her. She brings the bull. She brings offering of flour and wine. She's got this she's bringing offering. She's bringing praise and worship with her. Do you see? She's bringing these metaphors of worship. She's bringing these vehicles of worship. You can tell, I mean, she is walking to the tabernacle and she's got a bull and she's got offerings and there's this spirit of worship. And in the midst of this bull and this flour and this wine, it's like Gideon, remember? But she's got the real offering. Who's the real offering? And here, do you notice what it said? What did she do before she brought the boy to Eli? She sacrificed what? So there's this precursor, there's this moment. She takes the bull, and the bull says, God, I love you, and I sacrifice. This burnt offering is like my life. I owe you everything. I give everything to you. Imagine sacrificing that bull, giving that bull to be sacrificed, knowing what you're saying. When she gives that bull, the real test is still to what? Yeah, it's still to come. The bull, the flour, and the wine. Listen, and I want us to understand this because sometimes we give some things, but we don't give all things or the biggest thing. Like if she goes and gives the bull and gives the flour and gives the wine and then walks home, what does that mean? How precious to God is the bull and the flour and the wine without Samuel? Do you see what I'm getting at? Like, we can come to church, and you can give a bit of your time or your talents or your tithe or whatever, but if God is asking you for more, it's hard. That's why it's hard to worship knowing you're holding back. It's hard to make proclamation, and it's hard to really have peace and joy when you know, hey, God, I'll give you the bull, but it's not really the bull you want. Like God isn't really interested in us holding up our hands and singing loud if we're holding all this other stuff back. And the biblical principle is this. What's going to happen? The picture is what's going to happen, but the principle is this, that obedience is better than what? Okay, so that might sound Old Testament-like, or we don't have to sacrifice like that. But do you understand how we buy into that logic? Like we come against this. I know I'm acting crazy. I know I'm not doing right, but I give my time. Because I give my time to the church, that excuses this. That's not how that works. Because I give my money, I can do this. But guess what? That's not how that works. Obedience to God is more than what? Like if they could do one thing, just give me Samuel. And if you can't give me Samuel, don't bother with the bull. Because if you can't give me Samuel at this moment, then the bull means very what? Very little. Do you see? Obedience is better than sacrifice. In other words, if you obey, that's where the blessing is. That's where the power is. Like we sometimes think, I'll sacrifice God. But if we're sacrificing in the wrong way or the wrong things, or we're making sacrifices in the midst of not doing other things, we're messing the whole thing up. Again, look, you cannot give $1 million to the church and then not obey and think you're good. You can't spend all your time at church and be like, I've given my life to the church. A life given to the church without obedience, you've messed it up. We don't get to choose what areas we're faithful in. You can't say, I'm good in that area, so forget the rest. No. We've got to be faithful in all the areas. They sacrifice the bull to the Lord. They declare everything is yours. And then they go and give Samuel up. Look for a minute to Hosea chapter 6. Should be Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah. Hosea chapter 6. It's page 1412. Hosea 6 and verse 4. This is what I know. It's Tasha was like, how are you going from Samuel to Hosea? Well, hopefully you'll figure it out. Hosea 6 verse 4. This is why I never get through studies. O Israel and Judah. Hosea is ministering to the northern kingdom. In his lifetime, he keeps telling them, and Assyria is going to come and take over the northern kingdom. And Judah would fall to the Assyrians, to the Babylonians. Assyria is coming after the northern kingdom. And this is what I'm talking about. The same message from in Hosea, years before, is the same message now that I'm talking about for us today. Look at verse 4. O Israel and Judah, the northern and the southern kingdom. What should I do with you, asks the Lord. That's not a good thing. When your parents ask, what should I do with you? That's never a good sign. What should I do with you, asks the Lord. Listen to this. This is the people of Israel. And this is what, for your love or your faithfulness vanishes like the morning mist and disappears like dew in the sunlight. Think about what God is saying. Oh, you loved me, huh? You wanted to serve me. Me and you were good. But it vanished what? It vanished like the morning mist. How quick does the mist go? It's there for a moment and then it's gone. And then he says, and disappears like dew in the sunlight. Dew in the morning, the sunlight comes, and what happens to the dew? It's gone. Do you see what God is saying to them? Your love, your faithfulness, your service. Oh, you think you wanted me. You think you were. And he says, and your love vanishes. Why? Why? Because when their moment comes, when they are faced with temptations and trials, they what? They relinquish. They step backwards. They take on foreign gods. They do everything they can to run from God. And God's like, oh, we were close, right? But your love vanishes so quick. They had no backbone. They had no strength. They had no stamina. It disappears. And this is wild. This is awesome, amazing imagery. Look at verse 5. I sent my prophets to cut you to pieces. What? But look at what he's talking about. To slaughter you with my what? God didn't physically stab them, slaughter them, kill them. He sent his prophets to get their attention by what? By proclaiming judgment is coming. By telling the northern kingdom with Assyria and the southern kingdom with Babylon. Jeremiah, Isaiah for the southern kingdom. Hosea is doing it here. He's speaking to both. And he says, I sent my prophets to cut you to pieces. That's what the word of God does. It cuts us asunder. It makes us realize where we're wrong. That's why we run from the Bible. That's an amazing description of what the Bible does to us when we're wrong. It cuts us to pieces. It cuts our excuses. It's trying to cut our sin. It slaughters our pride. It slaughters. You see, that is I'm telling you, I know by my own experience, that is why you can tell me what you want. But when we run from this, it's because we are getting slaughtered by his words. There is something that God is saying to you that you don't what? that you don't like. And yet this is like the scalpel. This is what gets rid of your cancer. This is what God uses to remove spiritual cancer. And we look at it like, no, I'm good. And so what happens? The cancer grows. And he says, I sent my prophets to cut you to pieces, to slaughter you with my words. In other words, Hosea says, God has repeatedly told you, wake up, stop doing it. And look at what he says, with judgments as inescapable as light. What does that mean? That means judgment, as sure as it's going to be light today, your judgment is what? When God says, basically, if it's going to be light outside tomorrow, your judgment is assured, guess what you can know? Judgment's coming. He basically says, as long as the sun shines tomorrow, your judgment's coming. And then he says this, and this is the point. To slaughter you with my word, with judgments as inescapable. If you can escape light, you can get away from it. You can't escape, try escape light. As inescapable as the light is your judgment. And then he says this, I want you to show what? Mercy or love? Both. I want you to show, this is the heart of God, and this is what I'm getting at. This is, in this story, it's our story. I want you to show love, not offer what? So what does that say for us? What does that say for Hannah? Don't come here in worship and offering and give me a bull and give me the flour and give me the wine and then walk away. I want Samuel. I want Samuel. Abraham, I want your son. I want your son. What does it mean for us? It means this, that we have to, what does God say he wants us to show? Love. What kind of love? God-type love to who? Here, let me, when we can't treat each other right, your offerings mean little. You can't be rough with church. You can't be rough with people. You can't act like a crazy person and then say, well, I'm a pastor. You see how people do that? I've been a deacon, I've been a pastor, I've been a member. Yeah. But not anyone in position or any believer, you can't not love God, you can't not love one another and then think your offering means something. Like, how much does it mean if you serve the church but you don't love the Lord? Or you don't love one another? You see, we live in this messed up idea that because they've done so much, then they must be holy. Offerings without love. He says to Israel, to Judah, I want you to show love. I want you to be merciful. Not offer sacrifices. I don't want your sacrifices when we're not even close. And then he really hits it. I want you to what? I want you to know me. Listen, can you play church without knowing God? Absolutely. You know who did it best? Before the church, but you know who did it best? Judas. Do you realize how many offerings Judas had to give? Think about it. Nobody knew it was Judas. Thereby, he had to be doing everything that everyone else was what? So when the Lord took up some money, guess who was giving? Yeah. When he asked for time, guess who had to give their time? When he asked for whatever, Judas had to give the Lord a lot. And you know what that really meant in the end? Do you know what Judas won in that? Judas didn't know the Lord, he didn't love the Lord. So everything he did was what? Superficial. We got to stop believing that, oh, Judas is a good man. That's what happens in our culture. Oh, he's a good man, he's always around. That doesn't mean that. We got to be a bit wise. Like, Judas gave all of this stuff to the cause, and yet what was lacking was he never really understood or embraced or experienced or illuminated the love of God. And all Jesus wanted, you imagine if Judas ever washed Jesus' feet, what does it mean to him? Judas, I don't want you washing my feet. I don't want you giving your time. I don't want you doing all. I just want you to love me, to know me. That's all I want, Judas. I just want you to know me. More than I want burnt offerings. And I think we think sometimes as long as I give my tithe, as long as I do a service, as long as I'm good. No. God wants you to be merciful. He wants to know you. He wants to know you. If you and God aren't growing, if you're not intimate, if there's not that knowledge and that experience, then what we're doing, we're missing the boat completely. And Hannah comes and she gives of her child. Point number 4 is this. Our love for God is to be consistent and constant. It can't fluctuate. He says to Israel, to Judah, your love vanishes. It disappears. Your love for God has to, it should keep growing, but it should also be consistent and constant. It can't fluctuate the wrong way. Yeah, you can grow in the Lord, and we'll never fully understand it. It's too big, too high, too wide. But it mustn't fluctuate backwards. It mustn't vanish. It mustn't disappear. We must love him with everything we have at all times and in all places. We can't be like Judah. We can't be like Israel, who he says, your love's gone. Where's your love? The church at Ephesus, you've lost your first love. We have to love God every day. And loving God should be easy because he's perfect, right? He's holy. But we can't allow that love to fluctuate. We can't stop loving him no matter what the situation, whatever the place, whatever the time. Point number 5 is this. And we've all been there, I think. We cannot afford, we cannot allow, we must pray against our consciences being hardened or seared. Our consciences sometimes can be hardened, right? Our consciences can be seared. You ever looked at someone and thought, how can you be doing that? Well, we're all messed up for number 1. But sometimes your conscience gets seared. Sometimes you can mess around so long, and the Lord talks about here, he withdraws from them. And you can mess up. You ever noticed, and I know no one's ever done this, but you ever done something that you never thought you would do and you felt terrible about it? And it basically destroyed you for a minute, and you cried, and you asked for forgiveness, and what did you say? I'll never. And then 2 weeks next Tuesday. And then 3 weeks next Friday. And by the 12th time, you know what? The tears that were so flowing the first time, it's now like, it's no big deal. And somehow, it just lessens and lessens, right? It just does. 50 times later, I'm not saying that you don't feel anything, but it's not like it was. And we think we get away with it, and we think we're in a great spot when we're not getting convicted. People that sit in church and like, man, that was awesome. I didn't get convicted. That's not awesome. We should be moldable. We should be pliable. How quick can our conscience be seared and hardened? Something had happened to Judah and Israel where they're not even listening. We got to fear the Lord. We got to be consistently being convicted and changed and challenged by his word. In Hosea, their consciences are seared, they're hardened. That's the one thing Hannah couldn't have. She couldn't have a hardened conscience, and she didn't. She had this constant love for God. And I want to show you these 2 verses to show you what I'm talking about. Look at Hosea 5:6. Hosea 5:6. Yeah. Here's what we have a hard time understanding. And this will show you, let me read it. When they come with their flocks and herds to offer sacrifices to the Lord. Here's what he's talking about. Again, Israel's leaders. When they come with their flocks and herds to offer sacrifices to the Lord. It looks good, right? That's what you do. You're serving the Lord. Oh, they're great people. They're offering their flocks and their herds. They come to offer sacrifices. But what does it say? They will not find who? They won't find God. You imagine the picture. They're coming to offer sacrifices to the Lord, and they will not find him. Why? Because he has what? Okay. We have to understand. I'm not saying that God withdraws from you means that you lose your salvation. You'll always have the Spirit. You'll always have a bit of I mean, even at our worst days, because of the Spirit, we'll still be revving a little bit. There'll still be a little piece, a little something in there, because you can't get away from that. You can't destroy everything. But I do believe there's a real sense in which the Spirit withdraws. Not that he leaves us, but his hand of blessing. And the Lord allows us to get to the point where our conscience is so bad that finally we get to rock bottom and we really think, I got to do something about this. What I'm saying is this. Sometimes we get to the point where we forget that God doesn't mess around. You're not going to find, it says you won't find him because he is withdrawn from them. You know how much Israel's leaders are worth when God withdraws from them? And look at chapter 6, verse 11. This is God. And this is the God that we don't want to talk about, that we don't want to think about. O Judah, this is the southern kingdom. O Judah, a harvest of punishment is also waiting for what? Look at what God says. The northern kingdom, you're in trouble. And the southern kingdom, Judah, he says, a harvest of punishment. Now, how much you fear the Lord is determined by how much you believe this. Like when you read this, do you understand this? Like, is your conscience clear? I mean, not as in like, oh, I'm clean. I mean, do you really understand who God is? He says a harvest of punishment is waiting for you. We don't want to talk about a God who has this, like these discipline awaiting us. But listen to the heart of God. Though I wanted to restore the fortunes of what? I wanted to restore your fortunes. I wanted to bless you. I wanted to give you. I wanted to do something amazing. And yet you kept with your arrogance and your ignorance and your ungodliness and your idolatry, and your consciences were hardened. They were seared. And Judah, you're going to be punished. And we say, woo, what kind of God is that? But listen to the heart of God. I wanted to restore the fortunes of my people. And what I'm getting at is this. Do we really believe and understand those truths? Do we believe that there is a sense in which when I let my conscience go, that there is something we lose? There's a case somewhat of God withdrawing. Again, not losing your salvation, not losing the Holy Spirit, but you lose blessing, you lose peace, you lose joy, you lose fulfillment. God just basically, the way I would describe it is he kind of just takes his hand off a minute. And in verse 11 of Hosea 6, a harvest of punishment. And yet what did Judah do? Nothing. They heard, and you know when you read Jeremiah, you know what it says? You ain't coming. We've been your people for years, and God kept saying, I'm coming, I'm coming, I'm coming. And you know what they said? You ain't coming. We're your people. And what's really arrogant and ignorant about that, God had already taken out the northern kingdom. Assyria had already destroyed 10 of them, and there's only 2 left. And Babylon's coming, and they kept saying, Babylon's coming, and God's people were like, you ain't coming. And then the day came when the temple was ransacked, when the temple was destroyed. And God said, I told you I was coming. I told you punishment was coming. That's not what I wanted. I wanted to restore the fortunes of my people, but you didn't. And God is gracious and merciful. After 70 years, he restores them and he does all of that. But we can't let our consciences get hardened. We can't let our consciences be seared. We got to fear the Lord. And we have to look at our lives and say, am I constantly being convicted, being changed, being challenged by his word? And what happens when we're cut with his word? What happens when his word starts to cut us to pieces? Do we just thank God for being an amazing surgeon and taking away the cancer? Or do we run away and refuse? What'd you say? Oh, absolutely. What would you do for a doctor who's saving your life by removing imagine getting mad at the doctor who's saving your life. I mean, imagine walking out of a thing and the doctor saying, you need to stop that. Well, how dare you? All right then. You know, no doctor has ever really felt bad about telling me to lose weight, and they all seem to love that line. But a doctor that won't work on you or tell you the truth isn't very what? This is your doctor. This is your help. This is your prescription. We can't allow lots of people, we get there, where our conscience is seared. We go down and then we say, It's all right, I go to church. It's all right, I serve there. And we get in this habit of showing off our sacrifices, but our obedience is gone. And obedience without sacrifice without obedience, it's not a good place to be. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts?